In today's class, we'll be looking at each of the class of algae in full details. And we'll be starting with cyanophyceae. Cyanophyceae, which are also called the blue-green algae, are also known as cyanobacteria. Now, this cyanobacteria, as a name, would be paid more attention because most of the examples in this class, say nostoc, anebena, oscillatoria, and the likes of it, are actually plants whose features are mostly prokaryotic. From the word bacteria, we know that bacteria belongs to the prokaryotic cell alongside the archaea. Now, we also know that bacteria or prokaryotic cells in general are cells lacking membrane-bound organelles. And so the first characteristic of cyanobacteria is that they lack true nucleus. They lack true nucleus because their nucleus is not membrane-bound. It is unlike eukaryotic cell whose nucleus is double membranous. They have inner membrane and they have outer membrane. But for bacteria, they do not possess that membrane-bound organelle or membrane-bound nucleus. And so their nucleus is not a true nucleus. So instead of calling it a nucleus, we instead call it nucleoid. All right. The next characteristic tells us that they possess no chlorophyll. Okay, the word they possess no chlorophyll is not really true. But what we are saying here is that they possess no chloroplast containing chlorophyll. All right. So the next characteristic is about the pigments. Now, these pigments that they possess now, we have chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, phycocyanin, isoxanthin, and carotene. Of course, we've discussed about pigmentation for cyanobacteria and other classes of algae. Now, where are these pigments coming from, or where are they stored? Generally, we know that plant pigments are usually in their chloroplast. But this time you need to understand there are two areas where pigments of plants can actually be located. The first is in the organelle chloroplast, and the next is in a region called chromoplasm. Now, this is an organelle. Okay, this particular one is an organelle, which is a membrane-bound organelle. But because the organism we're dealing with, which is cyanobacteria, is not a membrane-bound kind of species because it's a prokaryote, hence it will be lacking a membrane-bound organelle like chloroplast. So instead, it possesses chromoplasm. Now, chromoplasm is just a region at the peripheral or at the surface of the algae, which is the cyanobacteria, that helps to trap light. And so the plants can actually use it for photosynthesis. It means that photosynthesis occurs at the chromoplasm of cyanobacteria or cyanophyceae. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about as far as their characteristics is concerned is their food reserve. They reserve food in form of cyanophycean starch. Okay, this starch is actually a carbohydrate and it looks more like a glycogen. Now note that Oscillatoria, as an example of cyanophyceae, undergoes what we call fragmentation. Fragmentation is a kind of reproduction that algae generally undergo. And so when it undergoes fragmentation, its parts are called, or the fragmented part is called homogonia. Also note that cyanophyceae are vegetative cells. What does it mean to be vegetative? It means that the cells are active metabolically, which means that they carry out metabolism and other life processes apart from reproduction. Does that make sense? But you need to also understand that during unfavorable condition, what does it mean to have an unfavorable condition? Unfavorable condition of too much heat or temperature, okay, then unfavorable condition of desiccation. What do we mean by desiccation? Desiccation is dryness, right? Or unfavorable condition of extreme cold. Extreme cold. Another unfavorable condition is when there's lack of nitrogen. Lack of nitrogen as a form of nutrient. Okay? When these things happens, we said that the cell is undergoing an unfavorable condition. And so what does the cell does in response to that? It forms a thick wall around itself called an akinetes. Now, what's the purpose of that thick wall? The thick wall is to help it conserve water. The thick wall is to help it protect itself from high temperature. Another thing the thick wall does is that it protects it or helps to restore the normal condition of the cell. Does that make sense? Now, another thing that the cell can do in response to that is to form heterocysts. Heterocyst is a kind of structure or cell that cyanophyceae form in order to fix nitrogen or in order to get back nitrogen from the environment. So what are akinetes and what are heterocysts? Let's go into it. So akinetes are dormant. What do we mean by dormant? Dormant means that the life process that undergo when they hold the vegetative status is actually reduced. Okay, so we say that akinetes are dormant cell, which means that they do not carry out complete life processes when the cell, that tick cell, is formed around them as akinetes. So I take the definition again. Akinetes are dormant tick cell wall that are resistant to cold, to desiccation, okay? And they are formed, that akinete is usually formed by vegetative cell during unfavorable conditions, such as temperature, nitrogen deficiency, and light deficiency. Okay, I didn't mention light as part of the condition here. But note that when favorable condition is restored, right, the cell try to restore back its vegetative status. That means that they take back their form of being vegetative, okay, when there is now favorable condition. But note that during the process of forming an akinete, inside that place, right, the cell can actually reproduce. Inside that wall, the cell can undergo reproduction. And the next we have is what are heterocysts? Heterocysts are specialized nitrogen fixing cells that are usually formed by vegetative cell, which is the cyanophyceae, in order to fix nitrogen, okay, nitrogen, but they do that in an anaerobic condition, with the aid of an enzyme called nitrogenase. All right, now we have the classic Euglena. Euglena, as an example of Euglena, possess greenish yellow coloration or focal pigmentation. In our last video, we talked about how to pick pigments for each of the class of algae, and of which Euglena possess chlorophyll A, chlorophyll E, and carotene. Now, the chlorophyll B is actually coming from the fact that Euglena itself is greenish in color. Now, we have the nutrition of Euglena. Euglena possess two kinds of nutrition. We have the autotrophic nutrition and saprophytic nutrition. It possesses autotrophic nutrition because it possesses chloroplast, unlike the cyanobacteria or the cyanophyceae that possess no chloroplast. Now, note that the mode of nutrition of Euglena can either be autotrophic or saprophytic. Now, they possess autotrophic in the presence of light. Now, in the absence of light, what happens to Euglena? Euglena loses its green color. Normally, Euglena is greenish yellow in color, which means that it has both green and yellow coloration. Now, the greenish coloration of Euglena tells us the presence of chlorophyll in the chloroplast, which capacitates it to undergo autotrophic nutrition. But when there is no light, which means that autotrophic nutrition only occurs in the presence of light. In the absence of light, what happens to Euglena? Euglena loses that green color temporarily, right? And then turns to be saprophytic. What are saprophytic organisms? They are organisms that feed on dead organic matter. So the next characteristic under Euglena is that Euglena possesses a pair of flagella, which means that it has two flagella. One is dormant and the other is active. So if you look at this diagram very well, you observe that this is a flagella, okay, and we have this also has flagella, okay. So it means that there are two flagella. In the end, is only one that is active, so the other remains dormant, and the dormant one is found inside the gullet. So this region represents the gullet for an Euglena. Moving on, Euglena belongs to a dual kingdom. Why? Because it has some plant features and animal features. Euglena was considered a plant because it possessed chlorophyll and it undergo autotrophic nutrition, whereas possess eye spots, gullet, pellicle, and flagella, which makes it to have that ability to move or to undergo locomotion. These conditions or these properties makes Euglena to be classified under the animal kingdom. Hence, we can say that Euglena falls under two kingdoms, which is the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. So the next thing is for us to talk about its food reserve. So for the food reserve, Euglena stores its food as paramylon, which is a carbohydrate. Now, does Euglena undergo reproduction? Yes, it does, but only asexual reproduction. And this asexual reproduction is divided into two phases. The first phase is during unfavorable condition, and the second phase is when the condition is favorable. Now, for the first phase, it undergoes that kind of reproduction in the presence of low food and low light supply. And for the second phase, that is when favorable condition is now fully restored, where the cell wall of the Euglena becomes thickened, and then the Euglena can now further divide into two or more of itself. That makes sense. So the next class is Bacillariophyceae. So for Bacillariophyceae, the major example is diatom, and another name we'll call Bacillariophyceae is glassy algae. Now, this diatom can be a golden brown diatom, it can be yellowish green, okay, and few other colors exist, okay. Now, this diatom that we're talking about, that is an example of Bacillariophyceae, takes its name glassy from the composition of its cell wall, because its cell walls does not decay. Okay, its cell wall does not decay, and the reason it does not decay is because it's made up of pectin and some other tough material. Now, before talking about diatom itself, let's talk about the pigments of the Bacillariophyceae. The pigments are chlorophyll A, C, carotenoid, fucoxanthin, which is the major one, okay, for brown algae. Now we have the food reserve. The food reserve is chrysolaminarin, and that chrysolaminarin is a carbohydrate on its own, is a polysaccharide on its own. And so, guys, it is very important to take note of these food reserves that we've been talking about. Food reserve for blue-green algae, that is cyanophyceae, I mentioned is chrysophycean starch. And the food reserve for Euglena that we mentioned is paramylon. And we said that the food reserve for Bacillariophyceae is chrysolaminarin. Now, when an examiner asks you to write about each class of algae, you talk about whether the class of that algae has some order. After the order, you talk about the characteristics, then you talk about their nutrition, then you talk about their food reserve, then you talk about their reproduction. If there is something special about a member of that group, you talk about it, like we picked diatom as a special member of Bacillariophyceae. That makes sense. Okay, so talking of diatom, diatom is made up of silica, which is SiO2. Okay, hydrated silica. That's the cell wall is made up of hydrated silica, and that cell wall is a double cell wall. Does that make sense? And that double cell wall is called fructose. Each half of the fructose is called a theca. And note that the name glassy algae comes from the fact that its cell wall is very rigid and does not decay. I think I've mentioned that before. Now let's talk about reproduction in diatom. How does diatom undergo reproduction? Now, the cell wall of diatom, we said, is actually a double cell wall, which is called fructose. Now, half of this fructose is called a theca. Now, note that this theca, if you divide it into half, one become the epitheca and the other become the hypotheca. Now, for diatom to divide, or undergo reproduction, the two theca, that is the epitheca and the hypotheca, plays a very vital role in that division. The diatom divides along each half of the theca, that is the fructose, which is the full one. So if the fructose divide, it forms the hypotheca and the epitheca. Do you understand? So when it divides, when the epitheca and the hypotheca finally separates, they would need a complementary theca to make up a new organism on its own. So what do? They make a new theca as support for that separation. Does that make sense? Which means that for epitheca, it makes the cell that has divided will have to make a new hypotheca. For the hypotheca that just divided, will have to make a new epitheca. And that is how diatom undergo reproduction. But then note that when this reproduction take place, or when this cell division take place, that's the new cells becomes smaller in size when compared to the parent cell. And our next class is Phaeophyceae. So for Phaeophyceae, which are the brown algae, and Rhodophyceae, which are the red algae, we're taking a very brief note on that. So note that The Phaeophyceae are the most advanced algae, that is, they are thalloid, which means that their body parts are not still differentiated, but then they are more advanced than other class of algae. Then they are known as seaweeds. You already know about the pigment from our previous video, which is chlorophyll A, C, and fucoxanthin. Then the food reserve for Phaeophyceae is laminarin. But take note, there is an example that is called laminaria. Laminaria and laminarin is not the same thing. One is a food reserve and the other is an example. Then I move to Rhodophyceae. So for Rhodophyceae, they are mostly aquatic, while few of them are marine and others are freshwater habitats. Then they are usually found on rock, and these are the pigments of the Rhodophyceae. So the last two things that we have to talk about is the form in which this algae can exist, and then the economic importance. Let's quickly go through it. The following are the range of forms algae can exist. They can usually exist as unicellular, that is a single cell, as colonial, that is they can exist in colony, and they can exist also in thalloid form or filamentous form. These are the four range of forms that algae can exist. So for unicellular algae, the characteristics are they are flagellated. Now, the fact that they are flagellated does not mean that they have to be motile. That doesn't mean that they have to be moving. Okay, so but there are some of them that are flagellated motile, and there are some that are flagellated non-motile. It means that they possess flagella, but they do not move. Then most of them are independent, which means that they can carry out all the life processes. Then they are primitive. The kind of reproduction they undergo is still BSF, which is binary fusion, spore formation, and fragmentation. Then they are mostly aquatic. Example of single-celled algae that we have is Euglena, Cholera, Chlamydomonas, and the likes of it. Then Colonial. What does it mean for algae to exist in colony? It means that they are cells, okay? But these cells now, they have one relationship or the other. Now, the major relationship between cells of algae that usually exist in colony is that they possess a strand that connects them, which is called the cytoplasmic strand, or what you call a mucilaginous strand, which helps them to be in colony. Now, the fact that they are connected does not mean that each cells in that colony cannot live independently, which means that each of them live independently. Example is volvox. If you look at volvox, they are usually connected like this. Some little lines are connecting them, which are the cytoplasmic strand. That does not mean that this particular cell cannot live independent of this. They can live independently and they can carry out all life processes independently despite they are connected. Does that make sense? Now, you should know that most of them are aquatic and flagellated, motile and non-motile, which means that all of them possess flagella, but some cannot move and some can. Now, the next thing is thalloid form. Thalloid form, of course, you're expecting the Phaeophyceae here because we just talked about the Phaeophyceae, that they are the most advanced. We said that they are the most advanced. Again, most of them are aquatic. Thallus body means they cannot be differentiated into stem, root, and leaf. Then they are dichotomously branched. That word dichotomously branched. So this is what it means to be dichotomously branched. All right. So this is a plant called fucus. Fucus is an example of the Phaeophyceae. Okay. Other examples are saga, some ectopopus, and the likes. Now, this plant. So this gap left at the middle, that is the branching here, tells us that it is dichotomously branched. Now the same thing is observed here too, which tells us that it is still dichotomously branched. Note that it is not only fucus that can possess this kind of structure, sargassum too can possess that structure. And this blue here tells us is the frond, and this part is called the stipe. The bottom is called the holdfast. And lastly, they are made up of tiny particles in their receptacle. These tiny particles are present in their receptacle. Okay, so this round stuff here is called the receptacle. And lastly, the filamentous algae. The filamentous algae are usually spiral shaped. Example, we have Oxalatoria, we have Anapina, and we have Olotrix. On this note, we are done with the range of forms that algae exists. And lastly, we'll go into the economic importance of algae. The following are the economic importance of algae, and this economic importance is generally classified into four. We have PMF. The F carries 2 bullet points. The P tells you pollution. The next tells you medical, that is, they are used in the medical field. The next tells you about how they are used in the food industry or in the production of food, or how they affect yield of food. Then the last one is talking about fertilizer. So these two still talk about the agricultural importance. Okay, let's quickly run through it. So the first is pollution. What are the economic importance of algae has regards or in respect to pollution? The first is it tells us that a water body has been polluted. Now note that any water body that is very greenish in color tells us that algae are actually present in that water body, and so such is observed in water bloom. So what do we call water bloom? That is when there is a lot of nitrogen or there is large deposit of nitrogen in a particular water body, and so what happens? Algae try to flood that part because they want to feed on that nitrogen nutrient, and what it leads to eventually is water bloom. And so when we see such water body, we know that, oh, there's a large deposit of nitrogen, and what is actually fixing and what's actually in there are actually algae. And then another thing algae help us as regards pollution is that it helps us to treat water bodies that are polluted. The next is food. Certain algae like planktons serve as food to fishes and to man. Seaweeds are a form of food to man. Now, medically, how are algae used? Medical importance. So, algae like chlorella, which is an example of chlorophyceae under the order Chlorococcals, has an importance in the production of antibiotics. And the next is that they can serve as medicine. Medicine like algonates. Algonates is a medicine. Then, and the last thing is that they serve as fertilizer. That is, the seaweeds are a kind of fertilizer. Now, an assignment for you. What is or define water bloom? I hope this helped. See you in the next class.